The first man never heard the shot. He only felt the sudden absence of the man beside him. One moment, the deckhand named Rojas was leaning against the rusted railing of the river barge, smoking a cheap cigarette and complaining about the humidity of the Louisiana night. The next moment he was gone, not fallen, not slipped. Gone. His cigarette continued to burn in midair for a second before dropping to the steel deck. The second man stared at the empty space beside him, confused in the way people are confused when reality suddenly refuses to follow the rules it had been obeying all their lives. Then he saw the blood. A thin, dark line ran across the deck like someone had drawn it with a pen. He followed it with his eyes until he found Rojas lying against a cargo container 20 feet away. The hole in Rojas's forehead was so small it almost looked polite. The second man froze, a professional killer's signature, a .308 round. But that wasn't what terrified him. What terrified him was the silence. The river was quiet, the insects still hummed. A heron lifted from the water nearby with slow, lazy wings. No gunshot, no echo, no flash. Just a dead man on the deck of a moving barge. The guard's hand trembled as he lifted his radio. "Control, we have a..." The second body dropped before he finished the sentence. This one fell backward, his radio splashing into the dark water beside the hull. The barge continued drifting south through the bayou as if nothing had happened. No alarms, no shouting. Just the slow push of water against steel. 300 meters away, submerged almost completely beneath the surface of the swamp channel, Maya Callahan exhaled slowly into the cold water. Her rifle rested perfectly steady on the custom floating brace Frank had built for her when she was 17. Only the suppressor tip broke the surface. Nothing else. Not her face, not her hands. Not even a ripple. Her heart rate sat at 46 beats per minute. 4 breaths in, 4 breaths out. Her finger tightened against the trigger between heartbeats. Another guard stepped into the open on the deck. The man looked down at the bodies, confused. Maya watched the calculation form behind his eyes. Confusion, recognition, fear. The shot broke before he could shout. 300 meters of humid night swallowed the sound. On the river barge, the third body collapsed beside the others. Still no one knew where the shooter was. And that was exactly how Maya wanted it. Above her, on the muddy riverbank hidden behind a wall of cypress trees, Frank Callahan watched through an old pair of military binoculars. He said nothing. Frank rarely spoke during a hunt, but after 40 years in special operations, he knew exactly what he was seeing. Not luck, not instinct, discipline, precision. The kind that takes a lifetime to build, and the kind that makes powerful men very nervous, because tonight wasn't just a firefight on a forgotten Louisiana river. Tonight was the moment a buried secret, 30 years old, finally came back to the surface. A secret powerful enough to destroy a general. A secret that had already gotten Maya's father killed. And somewhere up the river, Brigadier General Harlan Strickland was racing toward a private jet, hoping he could escape the truth before it reached daylight. But he didn't yet know something. Maya Callahan was already in the water, and she had no intention of letting him leave. 72 hours earlier, the bayou had been silent. The kind of silence that only exists in places where humans are visitors and the land has no interest in acknowledging them. At 04:12 a.m., Maya Callahan stepped into the water. She didn't ease in. Didn't test the temperature, didn't hesitate. She walked straight off the muddy bank as if the swamp had invited her. The water reached her knees, then her waist, then her chest. The Louisiana bayou in late winter sat at 58 degrees, cold enough to steal the breath from most people within seconds. Maya never reacted. She kept walking until only her eyes and the barrel of her MK-14 rifle remained above the surface. On the bank behind her, Frank Callahan sat on an overturned aluminum bucket. A dented thermos rested beside him. He poured coffee into a chipped metal cup and watched his granddaughter through the early darkness. Frank had been watching people shoot for 40 years. Army Special Forces, foreign instructors, operators from half a dozen countries. He had seen Olympic marksmen miss easier shots, but Maya was different because Maya had grown up here. The swamp was not an environment to her. It was a language. Across the water, a plastic gallon jug hung from a cypress branch. Distance, 340 meters, the jug swayed slightly in the breeze. Barely noticeable but moving. Frank raised his binoculars. Wind, he said quietly. Maya didn't answer. She didn't need to. She already knew. The swamp carried its own wind patterns, subtle currents moving across the water surface and through the trees. Most shooters fought the wind. Frank had taught Maya to listen to it. She slowed her breathing, 4 seconds in, 4 seconds out. Her heartbeat dropped steadily. 50, 48, 46, stillness. Frank's first rule had always been simple. If the swamp notices you, you've already failed. Maya squeezed the trigger. The jug exploded. Water sprayed into the early morning light. Frank lowered the binoculars. "Half a click right," he said. Maya rose slowly from the water and walked back to the bank. Water poured off her gear. "I hit the target," she said calmly. Frank took a sip of coffee. "You hit where the wind carried the bullet," he replied. "That's not the same thing." She field-stripped the rifle with automatic precision, every movement exact, every part placed in the same order. She had done it thousands of times. Frank watched her quietly. 26 years old, 12 years of training in this exact stretch of bayou, and still improving. Most shooters plateau. Maya didn't. And that was what worried him, because somewhere out in the world were people who had built careers hiding dangerous secrets. Secrets that killed men like Maya's father. And the day Maya learned the truth about those secrets, Frank knew exactly what would happen. She wouldn't walk away. She would go hunting. And when Maya Callahan went hunting, people didn't usually survive it. By the time the sun had climbed above the sugarcane fields, Maya and Frank were already miles north of the bayou. Frank's truck rattled along the narrow Louisiana highway, the same way it had rattled along those roads for nearly 40 years. The dashboard vibrated softly, and the smell of swamp water still clung to Maya's clothes. Mixing with the faint scent of coffee that had soaked into the truck's upholstery sometime in the early 1990s. Maya sat in the passenger seat with her boots off, one foot resting on the edge of the dashboard. In her hand was a secure phone displaying a briefing file that had arrived exactly at 600 that morning. She had read it twice already. Now she was reading it again. The file was short, too short. Operations that involved international cargo vessels rarely came with so little explanation. The ship's name appeared in the header: Caspian Star, Commercial Cargo Vessel, Panamanian Registry. 12-day transit route from Odessa, 40 containers of unspecified classified material. Interception scheduled 30 miles south of the Louisiana coast. On paper, it looked like a routine maritime interdiction, the kind of operation Navy SEAL teams performed dozens of times a year. But Maya had spent enough time around intelligence briefings to know when information was being deliberately removed. She lowered the phone slightly. "Caspian Star," she said. Frank didn't look over. His eyes remained on the long, straight highway cutting through the fields. "Commercial registry?" he asked. "Panama flag through Cyprus. Cargo, 40 containers." Frank nodded once. Then he asked the real question. "What words aren't they using?" Maya scrolled back through the briefing again. Then she found it, or more accurately, she found the absence. "Chemical precursor materials," she said quietly. Frank's jaw tightened just enough to notice. The truck drove another mile before he spoke again. "What else?" Maya turned the phone over and looked out the window. Flat land stretched to the horizon. A hawk sat on a fence post beside the road, watching them pass with the indifferent patience of something that had no stake in human affairs. "The briefing avoids one word completely," she said. Frank didn't ask which one. He already knew. "Lethe," she said. The silence in the truck changed. Frank took a slow drink from the thermos. Outside, a blue heron lifted from a drainage ditch and glided across the highway. "Project Lethe was buried in 1991, he said. "Someone dug it up." They drove 11 more miles before either of them spoke again. The briefing itself happened at 1400 hours inside a temporary JSOC coordination office outside New Orleans. 6 operators sat around the table. Commander Garrett Holt stood at the front of the room. Holt was 42 years old and carried the quiet stillness of someone who had spent enough years in combat that tension no longer showed on his face. He ran the mission efficiently. Intercept the Caspian Star, board the vessel, secure the cargo, extract, night operation, 6-man element, standard maritime protocol, the kind of operation that should have been simple. But Maya noticed something strange almost immediately. Holt never once looked directly at her while delivering the briefing. Not until the very end, When the room cleared, he said her name. Callahan. Stay, the door closed behind the others. For several seconds, Holt said nothing. Then he crossed his arms and looked out the window. I have to pull you from the operation. The words landed flat in the quiet room. Maya didn't react. On what grounds? She asked calmly. Holt exhaled slowly. Pending psychological review. That answer meant nothing, and they both knew it. Orders came from above, Holt added. Above your pay grade. Maya held his gaze. Who issued them? Holt hesitated. That hesitation told her everything before he even spoke. Then he said the name. Brigadier General Harlan Strickland. For a moment the room felt smaller. Because Maya recognized the name immediately. And somewhere deep in the back of her mind, a memory stirred. Not her memory, Frank's. She left the building without another word. And the first person she called was Frank Callahan. When he answered the phone, she said only one sentence. Strickland just pulled me off the mission. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then Frank spoke. Where are you? In the parking lot. Stay there, he said. Don't take the highway. Because at that moment, Frank Callahan realized something Maya hadn't yet understood. The past he had buried for 30 years had just come looking for them. Maya reached the house just after 9:00 p.m. The small wooden place sat exactly where it always had, half hidden behind the cypress trees at the edge of the bayou. The porch light was on. The truck engine ticked softly as it cooled. But something was different. Frank was waiting inside, not sitting in his usual chair, standing. The kitchen table had been cleared completely. No plates, no coffee cups, none of the ordinary clutter that normally filled the room. Instead, the surface was covered with documents. Old documents. Real ones, not printouts, not photocopies. The kind printed on thick government paper that had begun to yellow at the edges after decades in storage. Some had red classification stamps across the top. Others had handwritten notes in black ink. Maya stepped into the room slowly. You've been busy, she said. Frank didn't smile. He set a glass of water on the table in front of her, then he stayed standing. That alone told her the conversation was going to matter. Frank only stood when the story was heavy. Operation Tidecolor, he said quietly. Maya frowned slightly. The name meant nothing to her. Kuwait, Frank continued. March 1991, 3 weeks after the Gulf War ceasefire. He picked up one of the documents and slid it across the table. We received a target package, single individual. Working name Petro. Maya scanned the page, target classification, engagement authorization, long-range sniper assignment. She looked up. You were the shooter, Frank nodded once. Distance was 1,100 meters. His voice remained steady, but his eyes had shifted slightly away from her. The brief said Petro was a Soviet intelligence asset preparing to defect. We were told he was passing sensitive information to foreign contacts. Frank paused, then he said the next part slowly. I took the shot. Silence settled over the kitchen. The bayou outside moved quietly through the trees. Frank turned another document toward her. A photograph, a man in his 40s, sharp eyes, American military haircut, name printed below the image. Alexei Petrov. Maya read the line beneath it twice, then she looked up again. He was CIA, she said. Frank nodded. He was American. The room felt smaller. The briefing was wrong, Maya asked. No, Frank said quietly. The briefing was a lie. He tapped the final page. A kill authorization form. One signature sat at the bottom. Frank's finger rested just beneath it. Petrov discovered something, Frank said. What? Frank inhaled slowly. A classified program called Project Lethe. Maya felt the name settle into place. The same word the Caspian Star briefing had carefully avoided. Frank continued. It started in 1988, off-book chemical weapons development, no congressional oversight. No international reporting. Maya's eyes moved back to the documents. They were building stockpiles, Frank said. Chemical weapons designed to be attributed to Iraqi forces if escalation during the Gulf War required justification. Maya felt her stomach tighten slightly. But the war ended too fast, Frank continued. The stockpile couldn't be destroyed without creating records, so they moved it instead. Moved it where? Maya asked. Anywhere it wouldn't be found. Frank tapped another page, shipping manifests, transfer logs, hidden cargo routes. Petrov discovered the entire program, Frank said. He planned to give the documents to the Senate Intelligence Committee. Maya stared at the signature on the kill order again. Someone stopped him, Frank nodded. Yes, who? Frank took a slow breath. Then he finally said the name, Harlan Strickland. The same name Holt had spoken earlier that afternoon. The same man who had just removed Maya from the mission. In 1991, he was a colonel, Frank said. He signed Petrov's termination order personally. Maya sat back slowly. The pieces began fitting together. The Caspian Star, she said. The containers, Frank nodded. The Lethe stockpile never disappeared. Someone has been moving it for 30 years, and someone else has been trying to find it. Frank slid one final document across the table, another photograph. A younger man, Russian military background, name printed beneath, Viktor Sirokin. Petrov had a son, Frank said quietly. GRU intelligence officer. Maya read the file, then she looked up. He's been hunting the stockpile. For 11 years, Frank said, and now the cargo is moving again. Outside the window, something large shifted in the water of the bayou. The dark current carried the sound away almost immediately. Maya looked down at the photograph again. Then she asked the question that had been waiting since the conversation began. Why pull me off the mission? Frank didn't answer right away, because he already knew the truth, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 30 years. Because Strickland knows I would tell you. Maya held his gaze. And if I knew the truth, she said quietly, I wouldn't stop. Frank nodded. No, he said. You wouldn't, and somewhere out in the Gulf of Mexico, a cargo ship named Caspian Star was already waiting in the dark. The Gulf of Mexico was almost perfectly calm that night. A thin moon hung above the water, just bright enough to turn the surface into a sheet of dull silver. 30 miles south of the Louisiana coast, the cargo vessel Caspian Star floated motionless in the slow Gulf swell. Its navigation lights were dim. Its engines were silent. From a distance, it looked exactly like what it claimed to be, an aging commercial container ship waiting for clearance to continue its route. But appearances were a language used to tell lies. Senior Chief Garrett Holt knew that better than most. He stood in the stern of the combat rubber raiding craft as it moved across the dark water at 4 knots. The small engine throttled low enough that its sound disappeared beneath the wind. 5 operators sat around him. No one spoke. There was nothing to say. The process was simple. Check your gear, check the man beside you, then check it again. Holt had crossed water like this 41 times in his career. The feeling of it had faded years ago. What remained was the routine, a series of small, practiced movements that happened automatically. Ahead of them, the silhouette of the Caspian Star slowly grew larger. At first, it was just a shadow against the horizon. Then it became a wall of steel, 160 meters of cargo vessel rising above the water like a quiet fortress. The ship's name was painted across the stern in faded white letters, salt-worn and peeling. Nothing about it suggested the cargo intelligence had warned about. Nothing suggested 40 containers of chemical weapons. That was exactly the point. Holt tapped the side of the boat once, the signal. The craft slowed further as they approached the port side of the vessel. Magnetic climbing clamps came out. One by one, the operators moved, fast, silent, disciplined. The first man reached the hull and secured the ladder. The rest followed without hesitation, boots gripping steel as they climbed. Greer reached the deck first. He rolled over the rail and flattened himself against the shadow of a container stack. Weapon ready. Eyes scanning. Clear, Holt came over the rail second. The smell hit him immediately. Diesel, salt. Rust and something else, stillness. Ships were never truly quiet. Even anchored vessels carried noise, crew voices, machinery, movement inside the hull. But the Caspian Star felt wrong. Too quiet. Holt raised a closed fist. The team froze instantly. He listened. Metal ticked softly somewhere in the ship's frame as it cooled from the day's heat. Water slapped gently against the hull. But nothing else. No footsteps, no voices, no crew. There should have been 18 sailors aboard this ship. Holt signaled forward. Petty Officer Leland Das moved toward the nearest container lock. He worked quickly, bolt cutter, heavy latch released. The steel door creaked open slowly. Das shined his weapon light inside, then he stopped, empty. Not empty the way a container looked after cargo had been removed. Empty in a different way. Clean floor, no straps, no weight marks, no residue, as if nothing had ever been inside it. Holt moved to the next container himself. He opened it, empty. Greer checked 2 more on the starboard row, empty, container after container, all of them the same, 40 containers. 40 empty metal boxes. The realization arrived slowly in Holt's mind like cold water spreading through his chest. They hadn't boarded a cargo ship, they had boarded a decoy. He reached for his radio, but before he could speak, Doss said something behind him, not a whisper, not quietly, out loud. "Sorry, Senior Chief," Holt turned. Doss stood in the open between the containers. His rifle rested on the deck, both hands visible. At his feet sat the gear bag that should have contained the breaching kit. Instead, inside the open bag was a small transmitter. A green indicator light blinked steadily, sending a signal. Holt stared at it, then he looked back at Doss. "How long?" Holt asked. Doss didn't hesitate. 6 months. The words felt heavy in the night air. "The transmitter activated when we boarded," Doss continued calmly. "But the location data started broadcasting earlier today, when I confirmed the launch window." Holt felt the cold pressure tighten behind his sternum. 6 months of briefings. 6 months of mission plans, 6 months of someone quietly selling every detail. "Who?" Holt asked. Doss answered immediately. "Victor Sirokin." The name landed like a stone. Holt opened his mouth to respond, and the first RPG slammed into the water beside the ship. The explosion tore a column of spray into the air. 4 fast attack boats burst out of the darkness from the northern horizon, engines screaming, weapons already firing. Muzzle flashes ripped across the deck as bullets hammered into steel. The night exploded into chaos. Holt dropped behind a container and grabbed his radio, because at that moment he understood the full truth. The mission had never been about seizing the cargo. The cargo had never been on this ship. The entire operation had been designed for one purpose: to put his team exactly where they were standing. And keep them there long enough for something else to happen somewhere else. The first minute of the firefight was pure instinct. Years of training took control before conscious thought could catch up. Senior Chief Holt rolled behind a container stack as rounds tore across the deck. Bullets sparked against steel walls and ripped through loose rigging lines that snapped violently in the night wind. "Contact north side," Greer shouted. The 4 fast attack boats circled the cargo vessel like wolves around wounded prey. Their engines roared across the dark water, the sound echoing against the hull. Automatic gunfire hammered the deck. The attackers were disciplined, not reckless pirates, professionals. Holt leaned out long enough to fire 2 controlled bursts from his rifle. One of the boats veered away immediately as rounds punched through its windshield. But they didn't retreat. They repositioned. That told Holt something important. They weren't trying to take the ship. They were trying to trap the team on it. "Doss stays alive," Holt barked over the gunfire. Greer already had the traitor pinned against a container with zip ties around his wrists. Doss didn't resist. He looked almost relieved. Another RPG streaked across the water. The rocket slammed into the ship's crane mount and exploded in a burst of flame and shrapnel. Metal fragments screamed across the deck. Holt felt a sharp impact on his left forearm. The pain arrived half a second later, clean through and through, bullet, not fatal. He ignored it. "Push starboard," Holt shouted. 2 operators moved with him, firing in disciplined bursts that forced the closest boat to swing wide. The attackers still didn't attempt boarding. They were waiting. Holding position. That was when Holt's personal radio vibrated in his vest pocket, not the team channel. A private encrypted line. He glanced down quickly between bursts of gunfire. 1 text message. 4 words. Strickland made a deal. Holt read it twice. Then the entire situation snapped into focus with cold clarity. The containers on the Caspian Star were empty. The real cargo had already moved. This ship was nothing but bait, and the SEAL team had been placed here deliberately, a loud distraction far away from where the actual shipment was traveling. Strickland hadn't just lied. He had sacrificed the team. Holt looked up as another burst of fire tore across the deck. Greer slid into cover beside him. "Something's wrong," Greer said. Holt nodded once. Yeah, they both already knew. Somewhere else in the dark waters of Louisiana, the real cargo was moving, and the men attacking this ship were simply making sure no one interfered. 200 miles north, deep inside the Atchafalaya Basin, Maya Callahan listened to every word of the firefight through a waterproof earpiece. She had been submerged for 4 hours. The cold no longer registered as pain. Her body had long since adjusted, turning discomfort into background information. The muddy bottom of the channel supported her weight as she lay perfectly still beneath the surface. Only the suppressor tip of her rifle touched the open air. Above the waterline, the bayou looked completely empty, but Maya heard everything. The gunfire, the radio calls. The moment Greer stopped responding, she closed her eyes. Frank's voice echoed in her memory from years earlier. 10 seconds, that was the rule. 10 seconds to acknowledge grief, no more, not suppression, containment. She counted silently. 1, 2, 3. By the time she reached 10, the emotional weight had already been placed somewhere deeper in her mind where it could not interfere with the task ahead. She opened her eyes again. The bayou stretched silent around her. Cypress trees rose from the water like black pillars in the moonlight. Frank stood on the muddy bank 20 feet away. A folded topographic map rested in his hands. He spoke quietly without looking down. "Greer's gone." Maya didn't respond. She already knew. Frank checked the GPS unit beside the map. "The real shipment left Morgan City 6 hours ago," he said. "River barge heading south through this channel." He tapped the map. "Estimated arrival here in 90 minutes. Maya adjusted the floating rifle brace slightly. "How many on the barge?" she asked. Frank thought for a moment. "Sirokin doesn't travel light when the cargo matters." He glanced toward the dark water upstream. 12 minimum." He paused. "Maybe 14. Maya remained perfectly still. "What about Sirokin?" she asked. Frank's voice dropped slightly. "He'll be there." Maya inhaled slowly through the cold water. Victor Sirokin, the son of the man Frank had killed in 1991. The man who had spent 11 years hunting the hidden chemical stockpile. The man who now had it. Frank checked the GPS again. "Transit window," he said quietly. 2 hours at most. The bayou moved slowly around them. Water flowed through the tangled roots of the cypress trees with the patient rhythm it had used for thousands of years. Maya adjusted the safety selector on her rifle, but she didn't disengage it yet. Upstream, far beyond the bend in the channel, something heavy moved through the water, a deep displacement pressure. Too large to be natural, Frank looked up. "Barge," he said. The hunt was about to begin. The barge appeared slowly out of the darkness. At first it was nothing more than a disturbance in the current, a wide ripple pushing through the still water of the bayou. Then the shape began to form behind the cypress trees. Flat, heavy. Silent except for the low diesel growl of the push boat behind it. The vessel moved cautiously through the narrow channel, its forward floodlight sweeping across the tangled swamp as if searching for something hiding in the water. Which, in a way, it was. Maya remained perfectly still beneath the surface. Only her rifle barrel and optics sat above the waterline, balanced carefully on the floating brace Frank had built years earlier from sealed carbon tubing. The scope lens barely cleared the surface. From the barge, it would look like nothing more than a broken branch drifting in the swamp. Maya's breathing slowed until each inhale lasted nearly 8 seconds. The world narrowed. Noise faded. The diesel engine became a distant vibration rather than a sound. Frank crouched quietly behind the cypress tree 20 feet away. Through binoculars, he counted figures moving across the barge deck. 13, he whispered. He paused. 14. The last man stepped forward into the dim floodlight. Tall, broad shoulders, dark tactical jacket. Frank lowered the binoculars slowly. "Sirokin," he said. Maya didn't ask how he knew. Some people carried recognition the same way they carried gravity. Victor Sirokin stood at the front of the barge, studying the dark swamp ahead with the quiet confidence of someone who believed the hunt had already ended. The containers behind him were different from the empty steel shells on the Caspian Star. These were sealed military transport crates, heavy, lead-lined. Each one capable of carrying chemical warheads that had been hidden for 30 years. The barge drifted closer. 70 meters. Maya's finger rested beside the trigger guard. Not yet. 60 meters. One of the guards lit a cigarette. The small orange flame briefly illuminated the group. 40 meters. Frank's voice came softly through the earpiece. "Wind 2 knots east." Maya adjusted half a click. 30 meters. Now she could hear voices on the barge, Russian, short commands, casual conversation, men who believed the night belonged to them. Victor Sirokin stepped closer to the edge of the barge. He looked down into the water, directly toward Maya. For a moment the world froze. If he looked 2 inches to the left, the reflection of her scope might catch the floodlight. But he didn't. Instead, he turned slightly and spoke to one of his men. That was the moment Maya chose. Her safety clicked off beneath the water. The suppressor remained submerged, hidden beneath the dark surface. She exhaled slowly. The crosshair settled. Center mass, first guard, the rifle fired. The sound was nothing more than a muffled thump under the water. The bullet struck the guard just beneath the collarbone. He collapsed before anyone understood what had happened. The cigarette dropped into the river. Maya had already shifted targets. Second shot. Another guard fell backward against a crate. Now the shouting started. Weapons came up. Flashlights snapped on. But none of them looked down. They searched the trees, the shoreline, anywhere except the water itself. Third shot, fourth. 2 more men dropped. The remaining guards scattered for cover behind the crates. Victor Sirokin didn't move. He remained standing exactly where he was, calm, studying the swamp. As if trying to feel where the bullets were coming from rather than see them. Maya adjusted the scope. Crosshair settled on his chest, but she didn't fire. Frank's voice came through the earpiece. "Wait," Sirokin suddenly spoke loudly in Russian. His men froze, then slowly lowered their rifles. One of them shouted something toward the darkness. Maya didn't understand the words, but Frank did. His whisper came instantly. "He says he knows you're here." Maya's finger remained steady on the trigger. Victor Sirokin stepped forward again. He looked directly toward the water where Maya lay hidden. Then he spoke in clear English. "Frank Callahan." Frank stiffened slightly beside the tree. Sirokin continued. "I have waited many years to meet you." The barge drifted another few feet closer. Now they were barely 20 meters apart. Sirokin spread his hands slightly to show he carried no weapon. "Your bullet killed my father," he said calmly. Frank stepped out from behind the cypress tree. The moonlight revealed him fully, old, weathered, but still carrying the posture of a sniper who had spent a lifetime behind a rifle. Sirokin studied him carefully, then he nodded once. "You look exactly as I imagined." Frank's voice remained steady. "You came a long way for revenge." Sirokin shook his head slightly. "No," he gestured toward the crates behind him. "I came for truth." The swamp fell quiet again. Even the insects seemed to pause. Sirokin's voice dropped slightly. "My father died trying to expose Project Lethe." His eyes shifted toward the containers. "These weapons should never have existed." Frank didn't move. "Then why take them?" he asked. Sirokin smiled faintly. "Because the world must see them." He gestured toward the barge again. "Tomorrow every intelligence agency on Earth will receive proof." Frank's expression hardened. "You think Strickland will let that happen?" Sirokin's smile faded slightly. "He will try to stop it." Then he looked directly toward the water again, toward Maya. "That is why he sent the sniper." Maya kept the crosshair steady on his chest. Sirokin nodded slightly toward her hidden position. "You are very skilled," he said calmly, "but this is not your war." Maya finally spoke through the earpiece, her voice quiet, controlled. "It became my war when you started killing Americans tonight." Sirokin tilted his head slightly. "Those men were soldiers," he replied, "sacrificed by their own commander." Frank's jaw tightened. The statement wasn't wrong, but it didn't make the deaths easier to accept. The barge drifted another few feet closer. Now the distance between Maya and Sirokin was less than 15 meters. Point-blank range for a sniper rifle. Sirokin looked down at the water one last time. Then he said quietly, "If you shoot me now, the truth dies with me." Maya's finger tightened slightly on the trigger. Because in war, truth was rarely simple. The bayou was completely silent. No wind. No insects. No movement except the slow current carrying the barge forward through the black water. Maya kept the crosshair steady on Victor Sirokin's chest. 15 meters. At that distance, the bullet would arrive almost instantly. No drop, no drift, just one decision. Behind the crates, Sirokin's remaining men stood frozen, their rifles lowered but not relaxed. They watched the shoreline and the dark water with the tense patience of soldiers who knew the next second could decide everything. Frank stood beside the cypress tree with his arms hanging at his sides. He didn't raise his rifle. He didn't even move. He simply watched the man whose life had been shaped by a single shot fired 30 years earlier. "You believe the truth will protect you," Frank said quietly. Sirokin shook his head. "No," the answer came calmly. "I believe the truth will expose everyone." He gestured slightly toward the crates behind him. Tomorrow these containers will reach international waters. Satellite evidence will follow. Documentation from my father's archives will be released to every intelligence service on Earth. Frank's eyes narrowed slightly. You think governments will thank you? Sirokin's expression remained steady. They will panic, he said, and panic forces change. The barge drifted another meter closer. The water lapped softly against Maya's cheek where she floated just beneath the surface. Her muscles burned from remaining perfectly still for so long, but the rifle never wavered. In her earpiece, Frank's breathing was the only sound. Then he spoke quietly. Maya, she didn't look away from the scope. Yeah, Frank paused for a moment before continuing. I killed his father because I believed the briefing. Another pause. Tonight you know more than I did. Sirokin listened to every word. His eyes moved between the two of them. History repeats itself, he said softly. Frank didn't respond. Instead, he slowly reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. One of Sirokin's men tensed instantly. But Sirokin raised a hand, stopping him. Frank pulled out a small object, a thin metal drive no larger than a coin. He held it up where the moonlight could catch it. Petrov wasn't the only one who kept records, Frank said. Sirokin's eyes sharpened. What is that? Frank tossed the drive across the short distance onto the deck of the barge. It slid across the metal floor and stopped near Sirokin's boot. Everything I found after your father died, Frank said. Shipping routes, false registries. Names connected to Project Lethe. Sirokin slowly picked up the drive. For the first time that night, uncertainty crossed his face. You kept this for 30 years, he asked. Frank nodded once. Waiting for the right moment. Sirokin studied the drive carefully, then he looked back at Frank. You could have destroyed Strickland long ago. Frank's voice carried a quiet weight. Back then nobody would have believed it. The swamp remained still, heavy. Sirokin closed his hand around the drive, then he looked toward the dark water again, toward Maya. You see, he said calmly, the truth already exists. Maya's finger rested against the trigger. She could end the entire conflict with a single movement, but something about the moment had shifted. Because now the war wasn't only about revenge or duty, it was about what happened after the shot. In the distance, a new sound drifted through the night. Helicopters, more than one. Frank heard them too. Strickland, he said quietly. Sirokin turned toward the southern sky. Faint red navigation lights appeared above the horizon. Fast, military, closing quickly. They found us, one of Sirokin's men muttered. Panic rippled across the barge, but Sirokin remained calm. He looked down at the containers, then back toward Frank. They will kill everyone here, he said. Frank nodded slowly. That's usually how cover-ups work. The helicopters grew louder. Searchlights cut through the distant darkness. Sirokin exhaled slowly. Then he did something none of his men expected. He raised both hands and stepped away from the crates. I will not run anymore, he said. His men stared at him in disbelief. You have the proof now, he continued, looking at Frank. Make sure the world sees it. Frank didn't answer. The helicopters roared closer. Rotor wash began disturbing the water surface of the bayou. Bright searchlights swept across the trees. And in that final moment before the sky exploded with light, Maya made her decision. She slowly lowered the rifle. The helicopters arrived seconds later. Armed soldiers poured from the hovering aircraft, ropes dropping into the swamp as the operation commander shouted orders through a loudspeaker. But by then, the truth of Project Lethe already existed in two places. One copy in Sirokin's hand, and one copy in Frank Callahan's past. And sometimes, that was enough to start a war far larger than the one that had ended in the quiet waters of the bayou that night. The rifle sank slowly beneath the surface. The hunt was over. But the story had only just begun.